High will reach 71. Tonight, there may be a few showers early on, but clouds will gradually clear out. The low will drop to 59. I'm meteorologist Jason Caterina on AM 560, The Answer.
Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. President Trump yesterday addressing the UN had a message for narco-terrorists and their state sponsors. I think President Sheinbaum and dictator Maduro might want to pay particular attention to what he had to say, that the bombings will continue until morale improves.
To protect our citizens, I've also designated multiple savage drug cartels as far as and you see this, and you see it happening right before your eyes. Let's put it this way. People don't like taking big loads of drugs in boats anymore. There aren't too many boats that are traveling on the seas by Venezuela. They tend not to want to travel very quickly anymore. And we've virtually stopped drugs coming into our country by sea. We call them the water drugs. They kill hundreds of thousands of people. I've also designated multiple savage drug cartels as far as foreign terrorist organizations, along with two bloodthirsty transnational gangs, probably the worst gangs anywhere in the world, MS-13 and Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua is from Venezuela, by the way. Such organizations torture, maim, mutilate, and murder with impunity. They're the enemies of all humanity. And for this reason, we've recently begun using the supreme power of the United States military to destroy Venezuelan terrorists and trafficking networks led by Nicolas Maduro. To every terrorist thug smuggling poisonous drugs into the United States of America, please be warned that we will blow you out of existence. That's what we're doing. We have no choice. Can't let it happen. They're destroying. I believe we lost 300,000 people last year to drugs, 300,000. Fentanyl and other drugs. Each boat that we sink carries drugs that would kill more than 25,000 Americans. We will not let that happen.
For commentary on whether or not that is within the constitutional authority of the president and other matters related to law and order, please be joined, as always, by Andrew McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, contributing editor at National Review, author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dan.
So he's not backing off. That's pretty clear in terms of the approach he's taken to designated narco-terrorist organizations. And I know you opined on this recently, saying that he does not have the constitutional authority to do what he's doing. Explain.
Well, he doesn't have the legal authority. The president has the authority to use lethal military force against foreign threats to the United States without congressional authorization, only if there's a attack on, or an imminent attack or an imminent threat to American interests of a military kind. Our law, you can argue that this is, wise or not wise, but our law criminalizes importation of narcotics as a crime to be prosecuted in court. And not only that, the first Trump administration brought 5 indictments, I think, against Maduro, Tren de Aragua, Maduro's cartel, which is known as our Cartel of the Suns, and various other Venezuelan figures. So I think that, Dan, that Congress could, I don't think they would do this, but I think Congress could equate a boatload of narcotics with a missile. That's kind of what President Trump's theory is here, that there's no functional difference between a foreign enemy naval craft firing a missile at the United States and a drug cartel, arguably, according to the president, under the direction of Maduro, shipping narcotics to the United States. I think Congress could draw that equivalence, but the president can't, not constitutionally. Now,
sorry to interrupt, but so when Obama used drone strikes to take out rank and file members of Al Qaeda or ISIS in faraway lands where there was no imminent threat they could possibly pose to the United States, at least not the homeland. Was he exceeding his authority in those cases?
Well, first, Obama's not the only one who did that, right?
No, true.
Going back to Bush did that.
Yeah.
But they were operating under. Now, I will preface this by saying I don't agree with this either, but they were operating under the post 9/11 authorization for the use of military force, which didn't have. It didn't name the enemy. That was one of the things I complained about it at the time. And it didn't have any temporal or geographical limitations. So what's happened with the 2001 AUMF is they have rationalized that it applies not just to the organization that carried out the 9/11 attacks, which is what it was meant to target in the first place, but all of its successor groups. So you have groups like ISIS, which didn't even exist as Al-Qaeda in Iraq back in 2001. So we're like two leaps from where ISIS is a breakaway faction of Al-Qaeda. But I think they've distorted, contorted, and otherwise stretched beyond recognition the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. But that's the way that it's been interpreted. That's the way that every administration since the Bush 43 administration has interpreted it as, basically, if you were somehow arguably covered by Al-Qaeda or its successor organizations, which are now manifold, that authorizes military force. And it's because Congress authorized it. In this instance, we're dealing with President Trump unilaterally saying he's got the authority to deploy these military assets to the Caribbean, which I do think he has the authority to do, but also to, shoot them without military provocation on the theory that a boat carrying narcotics is the same thing as a boat firing a missile.
Was taking out Soleimani Trump in the first term? Was that did that exceed his authority in your view?
No, because Iran at that time was conducting attacks against American military personnel and assets overseas, and Soleimani was coordinating it. So I think President Trump probably had a solid argument that he was taking out an imminent threat to the United States, which he's permitted to do without congressional authorization.
And so there again, like the analogy, and maybe you don't think there's the evidence to support this, but if there were, does the analogy of Maduro being directly connected to narco traffickers, which includes Tren de Aragua, gangbangers who are in this country committing crimes and otherwise imperiling public safety? I mean, is that enough of a nexus to establish a basis for the president?
It hasn't been historically. I think, first of all, I think Trump's declaration of Tren de Aragua and MS-13, for that matter, as terrorist organizations is very dubious. I don't think they're terrorist organizations, but the law gives the executive branch the authority to do that, and courts are not going to second guess the president on that designation. But I do think it's a big leap. We've never before designated organizations that are mainly narcotics trafficking organizations, at least as they interrelate with the United States, as terrorist organizations. But like, assuming that that is legally legitimate, whether it is or it isn't, a designation of an organization as a terrorist organization is not an authorization to use military force. Legally, what that does is it gives us the right to basically cut off their funding, prosecute people for providing material support to the organization, do a few more things monitoring their recruiting and their fundraising than we would otherwise do. The reason the designation process works with foreign organizations is because we wouldn't otherwise have jurisdiction over them. So Congress has this process in order to give our law enforcement and Treasury assets legal jurisdiction to cut off funding and material resources to these organizations. But it's not an authorization for military force. So, for example, we designated Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization in, I think, early 1999. It was after the 1998 embassy bombings at Kenya and Tanzania. Even though that authorization was in place, or the designation was in place as of 1999, when 9/11 happened, Congress still had to authorize military force in order to unleash the military against Al-Qaeda. That is to say, nobody thought that the fact that they had been designated as terrorist organizations in 1998 was good enough to authorize military force in 2001. That's why Congress voted for it.
But from a practical matter, is this just sort of the latest expansion of the imperial presidency? Pardon my Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Because, I mean, nobody is, minus a few civil libertarians and constitutional scholars such as yourself. But, I mean, nobody is moving to stop the president. It doesn't seem like anybody's interested in taking this up. So it's just going to be Congress not acting and the executive filling that power void, as happens a lot, and not just with Trump.
Yeah, well, this was predictable, though, right? First of all, Trump is doing this in a way that, is upsetting to people like me, because it's not just, Obama did, in principle, Obama and Biden did exactly the same thing. They basically said, screw what the law is, I'm doing what I want to do. Here, Trump is doing that too, but he's killing people, which is like taking a step further. But if you think about it, remember the litigation over immunity back in 2024, which was the biggest thing in the country at the time, right? And if you remember those oral arguments before the D.C. Circuit and the Supreme Court, what they were constantly doing was giving these hypotheticals, like what if the president uses military force against, X? And it was sometimes absurd examples, like what if the president ordered the armed forces to kill a, political foe, which of course the armed forces wouldn't do. But the more plausible hypotheticals were, what if the president ordered military force to start a war with a country we weren't at war with? And where the courts ultimately came out on that was, if it's an abuse of power, that's for the political branches, mainly Congress, to deal with, because courts and prosecutors in our system are not the check on presidential excess or presidential abuses of power.
Right.
So the practical reality, which is what you're driving at, is that if Congress won't rein the president in, the only limitation on what the president can do is his own sense of his political boundaries. He really can't otherwise. He's not going to be indicted. He's not, we now know, even if, let's say I think this is the worst thing a president's ever done. Let's say all of us thought it was the worst thing a president had ever done. The Supreme Court has said, and I think they're right about this, that a president can't be civilly sued or criminally indicted for official acts he takes as president. because in our system, the check on that is Congress. It's not prosecutors and courts. So Trump is not worried about that. He's not worried that he's going to be indicted for what he's doing now. And it's all, is Congress willing to step up to the plate and say, we're cutting off funding for this, or we're not going to give you any more of your nominees. We're not going to confirm. And, all the things that Congress has in its arsenal to try to bend the president to Congress's will. If it's not going to use those tools, then Trump could do whatever he wants to do, subject to his own sense of what his political and moral boundaries are.
Speaking of boundaries, he also posted over the weekend on Truth Social his impatience with the progress on criminal investigations into bad actors from the previous regime and from some that extend back to his first presidency, like a Jim Comey. Mentioned Comey, Schiff, and New York Attorney General Letitia James specifically saying they're all guilty as hell, but nothing is going to be done. We can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility. They impeached me twice and indicted me 5 times, ! Over nothing. Justice must be served now, in all caps, with 3!
Yeah, 3.
3. That means he means it. And so, Pam Bondi's on notice. I don't know what that does other than make it clear that the president is paying attention and he is going to expect some public resolution of this that I assume will be more detailed and impactful than the public disposition of the Epstein file matter. But how did you react to President Trump's impatience as expressed on social media?
Well, I thought it was, it was over the top, but like you could say that 5 times a week. Look, it's odd for him. I mean, he's just, he's intemperate when he gets in these moods, but for somebody, first of all, they didn't indict him over nothing. Some of the cases were over nothing. Some of them were over very serious misconduct, which may not have been prosecutable, but it was serious misconduct. And what he ought to take away from that is all these, like, people like Comey, say, who abuse their powers as director of the FBI. Comey has immunity just like Trump has immunity. People are not going to be prosecuted for things that they did in their government positions. And as far as this guy Pulte, who he's installed at the Federal Housing Financing Agency.
Mm-hmm.
If I was a prosecutor for a very long time. If you find that people have made misstatements on financial documents, that's the beginning of a fraud investigation. It's not a slam dunk fraud case.
Well, that's why he referred it to the Department of Justice.
Well, but he referred it by saying that they had committed serious felonies, and then Trump tried to remove the Federal Reserve governor by saying outright that she had committed fraud. And what they have is the beginning of a fraud investigation. And I would just, as I said in what I wrote about this over the weekend, it would be a useful reminder to President Trump that the case against him that I agree with him that he ought to be very upset about, that Letitia James brought, was based on a lot of misrepresentations that Trump made about his assets that didn't actually defraud anyone. Like the fact that he said that his apartment in Manhattan was, 30,000 square feet when it was actually 10,000 square feet, or 11,000 when he was, using it as an asset to get loans or what have you. That misrepresentation about the asset is the beginning of a fraud investigation. It doesn't establish fraud. And the criminal prosecutors, the Justice Department people who looked at this in the Biden administration, and then even Alvin Bragg's office, although it was mainly under Bragg's predecessor, looked at that and said, we're not bringing a criminal case on the basis of that because nobody got defrauded. Trump, yes, he exaggerated his assets, but he also said that his counterparties should do their own due diligence on the assets. and nobody lost any money, and all of the counterparties were happy to do business with Trump because they made money off it. So a prosecutor looks at that, even a prosecutor from Bragg's office who's dying to indict Trump on something, looks at that and says, that's ridiculous. I'm not bringing a criminal case on the basis of that. And all these people that Trump has appointed, they'd be delighted to make a case on Adam Schiff or James or Comey or what have you. It's that the evidence, either the evidence isn't there, or I looked at the Schiff case and the James case. These are like ancient transactions. The federal statute of limitations is 5 years. The cases would get thrown out in 2 seconds. And the reason that these guys are not bringing the cases is, Trump is ranting and raving that he wants these people charged, but the U.S. attorneys who bring that case are going to be embarrassed in front of the court. It's their own reputations for signing off on something like that that they don't want to do, which is why you've had a number of these U.S. attorneys have packed it in rather than bring these cases because they don't want to embarrass themselves. Bondi wanted this job, right? She's the attorney general, so she has to deal with Trump going crazy that these people haven't been charged. But the reason they haven't been charged is not that these pro-Trump prosecutors don't want to charge. They just don't want to be embarrassed because there's not cases there.
Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney, Southern District of New York, contributing editor at National Review, author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thank you as always. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dan.
And Andy joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Does your garage floor look lousy with stained or cracked concrete, or even worse, bad epoxy or paint?